handling JavaScript files. Now I have my project open in a text editor from where I last left off, and I'm just going to be creating two new files in this tutorial. One for the file that basically includes everything, and a JavaScript file to test that I'm handling a JavaScript file correctly and I can output what that JavaScript script is doing. So first I need to create the includes file. So just a new PHP file, and since this is going to be including things and my main script already does part of this, I might as well cut out this part of the script in my main file and stick it in the includes file, so that the includes file makes more sense to handle all of the includes. So I'm just adding it to that file, and I'm going to save this file in my WordPress directory in my plugin folder, and I'm just going to name it includes.php. And then just to get this working, I'm just going to type in to include this includes file in the main file of this plugin. So as I probably covered in the last tutorial, I'm going to use the WordPress constant for the content directory. So include WP content directory, and then constantate on the plugins folder and the name of my plugin folder, and then the name of the file I'm including. Then I'm just going to put a comment to remind myself that everything else is included in another file. So include all other files for the plugin from this include file. So now that's dealt with, we can save this file and go back to the includes.php. So now that we actually have what was in the main file before in this includes file, we can now include the JavaScript, which we're going to need a hook and a function. So we're first going to deal with the function, and this is going to be dealing with any kind of client-side includes. This could be CSS or JavaScript. So I'm just going to call this the name of my plugin. I'll actually make this specific to JavaScript to make the plugin a bit more flexible. So the name of the plugin dbsync_js for JavaScript _includes. Don't need to pass this function anything. To demonstrate JavaScript working, we're going to actually use jQuery, which is a common JavaScript library you've probably heard of. So it's actually quite common in WordPress and easy to work with, even though there has been some confusion with quite a few people with using jQuery in WordPress, because it can cause a few problems with the way it's set up to how you'd normally expect it to work. So this is also the proper way to start working with JavaScript in any WordPress project. So the first file we're going to include is the jQuery core, which already exists in any WordPress setup by default. So just to include that file, we simply use a WordPress function called WP onQScript. Just make sure I'm spelling this correctly. And then it's simply jQuery. Now, what this onQ script does, WordPress has a list of JavaScript files that it's recognized to be called by just a single name. So all these files within WordPress, if they're registered as being able to be called by just the name, you can use this function to call by their name, and that will make WordPress basically use a script tag that points to this file in wherever this function is hooked into. That should make more sense once I've moved out of this function. But now that we've got the jQuery core, which should, once we add a hook to this, which the hook is going to be for the main page, so the home page of this WordPress site will have jQuery in the JavaScript includes. So we're going to add another JavaScript file that's going to use jQuery to give us some kind of debug message so that we know jQuery is working and that it can execute JavaScript code. So I'm just going to create a second JavaScript file that's not already in WordPress. This is one of my own. So I'm just going to call this db sync specific file. Files, since we'll probably be adding more to it later. And then, unlike the first the first function, which we only needed to execute this function to get jQuery up and running, for our own scripts we need to use a set of two functions. Now, the one that hasn't been used before, I'm going to demonstrate with this file that I'm creating, is a function called WP register script, and this is basically what allows WordPress to call a JavaScript script by just its name, and this registers a file name as a name. And obviously this is the only real organised way to call JavaScript files in WordPress, and then onQ a JavaScript script to get it functional. So I'm just going to give the name of this file dbsyncready, because the file I'm going to be creating is called ready.js, so the naming scheme makes sense. So I've got the name we want to call for when we onQ it. Now we just need to point to the file, which you can use using the constant plugins URL, which this constant contains obviously a URL to the plugin directory of this plugin. So we'd be in the dbsync folder at this point. And then the name of our file, which will be ready.js, inside of this plugin's URL, which is a function, sorry. So this plugin's URL contains the URL of the plugin folder, which is dbsync, but also acts as a function to contain a file to generate a link. And then the second parameter of this plugin's URL is just the constant file, which you may see in a lot of PHP applications, which you can find out more information if you just Google it, although I'll provide some links in the description to kind of explain what this file does. So that's the register script done. Now we can move on to the onQ script. It's not completely necessary. To avoid any compatibility issues, I'm just going to duplicate this function and rename it onQ. Now, there's obviously this is a strange way of coding considering these functions look almost identical, and it doesn't look like you're really achieving anything by writing them both, but I'll explain later why it needs to be written like this and how you can modify it so it looks cleaner. But for now, this is the safest way to code registering it on onQ and JavaScript scripts. So just ignore the strange formatting. And then we just need to add the hook, which is add action. And then, because we want this to show in their head tags of any WordPress page, we'll use the hook wp_head, which probably showed you before in another tutorial. But this also works for functions which include things. So add action WP head. Then the second parameter is the name of the function we want to execute in this hook. So that would be the function we just wrote. So just copy and paste that into the quotation marks. So now that's all done, just close off this function because I ended it in the wrong part. Now that that's all done, I can now move on to the last file, which is the actual JavaScript file, which I'm just going to save. In my plugin folder. And I'm just going to name this, as I said before, ready.js. And another reason for naming it this is this JavaScript is also going to have some jQuery. That means the JavaScript wrapped inside this jQuery function will only execute when the page is fully loaded. And some people already know this. This function is document.ready. Hence the name of the file mostly. So now we can get to writing this JavaScript. Now, one thing to know, most people use this to access jQuery functions. Now, this can be a problem in WordPress, and it may work in some situations, but in most it will actually mean the jQuery doesn't work if you use that, and you'll be wondering why your scripts don't execute. And that's due to the dollar being possibly reserved by another JavaScript library in WordPress. So it's best to use the prefix for a jQuery function, simply jQuery, with a lowercase j, capital Q, and the rest of query in lowercase. This jQuery just basically replaces the dollar that you use for jQuery functions. So just write jQuery. And then the document. It doesn't matter whether you wrap this in quotations or not, because jQuery will still recognise that you're on about the document object. .ready, which is the jQuery function for executing any code within that function when the page is loaded. So ready function. So this basically allows us to pass code as parameters, as a single parameter, sorry. And in this we're just going to simply use an alert, which basically makes a pop-up message appear with any text we define in its one parameter. So alert jQuery is loaded and ready to be used. So basically what we're expecting, now that we've saved all this, is that once we reload the WordPress, the homepage of our WordPress site, we are now going to see this message in a pop-up box, which is this JavaScript file has been included by this function, which has been called by this hook, which occurs in the header of every WordPress page. So now we've got set up, we just need to reload this, which is my WordPress homepage of where this plugin is installed. And you can see here, jQuery is loaded, ready to be used. So that's all fully functional, and that's the end of the tutorial.